Welcome to Boats and Pros, the podcast where we tackle all things boats and fiberglass repair. Whether you're a seasoned pro or a weekend warrior, we've got the tips to keep your boat in tip-top shape. Let's get into it. Okay, everybody, welcome to Boats and Pros. I'm Nick Ireson.
I'm John Economy.
We're here to waste your time. This week, we're going to talk a little bit about some repairs and things like that. But first, we're going to feature our tool of the week. This is something that we use pretty frequently in the shop. It's become quickly one of our favorites. We did have a version that came from Amazon before we got this one, but that's right, you guessed it. This one's from Harbor Freight. It is a 32-ounce refillable pressurized sprayer, SKU number 59544. Basically, this guy is a little handheld squirty deal. Think like a maple syrup dispenser at IHOP, but instead of maple syrup, actually, I bet you could shoot maple syrup out of it, but it shoots whatever you put in there, and it has a little Schrader valve on top. You hook your little tire inflator to it and hit her with however many PSI you dare. I mean, I
think it maxes out at like 180.
Yeah, we just blast it. I don't think that our compressor's putting out 180, so we just fill it up. It lasts probably, I don't know, how long would you say you could spray out of that for if you just held it down?
4 minutes.
But didn't seem like a guess at all, dude. Anyway, this is something that I highly recommend you check out if you're using a lot of rollers, bubble busters. I guess you could clean your brushes. I don't really clean brushes anymore. I've given up on that. I just throw them away. But we do clean our hands with this thing from time to time. Not the best for your organs, I know, but we do it. We also spray down the gel coat and the spray rig from time to time with it. And it's just a nice thing to have on hand. If you're about to do a big layup and you're done and you're tired and you're trying to clean up real quick, and usually by that point your patience is gone and you're a little fatigued, and to have something that you can grab to help you out a little bit and get cleaned up faster is pretty nice. For the low price of $39.99.
Amazon is cheaper. I think I got mine off Amazon for $29.
The green one, the first time?
No, mine's actually red. The green one was yours.
Oh, I thought yours came from Harbor Freight.
No, mine came from Amazon. Mine's a Vector.
Okay, so I haven't tested the Harbor Freight one at all, but it looks exactly the same. So I'm willing to bet it's made by the same company.
Yeah, I mean,
there's not much to it.
It's a canister with a Schrader valve on top that you pour a liquid into, you pressurize it, and it does really good work, and you save a lot of any of your cleaning solvent that you're using. I could dump out of the 5-gallon drum, that amount on my hand accidentally trying to pour out of it.
Oh, yeah. If you don't have an organized way, another option that you can do is like just a good old-fashioned squirt bottle. If you get the right one, they do actually hold up pretty well. And right now we're running both. We have the pressurized sprayer and a squirt bottle and a 5-gallon bucket that we spray over. So we kind of catch the extra acetone there, and then we can swish our bubble busters and stuff around in that as well. And if you keep a lid on that, it'll last you pretty decently. So that's our little tool tip of the week. And now we're going to move on to start talking about our fiberglass repair here. Okay, so today we're going to talk about different kinds of repairs that you might be doing on a fiberglass product. The majority of the repairs that I do are on boats, but in the past I have done other things, cars, construction equipment, bucket trucks. But it's pretty much mostly boats. When you're doing a repair, there's a couple of things that you're going to have to figure out, and a couple of kind of basic procedures that if you follow, can't really get too far off track. Okay, so when you're coming into a fiberglass repair, you're going to have to make a couple of determinations before you can really get too far into the process. And the first determination that you're going to be looking to make is the severity of the damage. Are you looking at some cosmetic damage, or are you looking at some structural damage? And so we're going to go through some of the ways that you can kind of begin to make that assessment. And everything is on a case-by-case basis. And, you really have to just use a lot of common sense when you're doing this stuff. If there's a way that you can take a look inside or at the back of whatever laminate you're assessing, I always highly recommend that. You need to do as much of a thorough investigation as you can, looking at the outside surface. If you're forced to make a determination only from that, you can do it. It's okay, because inevitably, if you start grinding it, you're going to know what the depth of the real damage is once you start grinding. As soon as that gel coat's gone, it's very easy to see the amount of damage to the fiberglass laminate below it. one of the things that you can do once you grind all the gel coat off is actually spray some acetone onto the damaged area. And just for a second or two before it evaporates, it really helps to make the fiberglass transparent and highlight what damage you have. If you're looking at cosmetic damage, you're going to be looking at things like scratches in the surface, chips and gouges, things that's obviously from a specific incident of like, oh, look, there's a scratch there, or there's a little gouge from the dock there, or we're looking at the keel and there's some gouges from maybe some oysters or something like that.
A rock on the road.
Or a rock on the road flies up. Yeah, you're going down the interstate and you just have a little bad look. Those are all the things that happen that kind of fall into that cosmetic category. I would say you could also add fading and chalkiness to the gel coat, which is going to kind of be due to a lack of maintenance on the gel coat, really. If you're keeping it buffed and waxed, hopefully you won't be experiencing chalkiness. But, you might be buying a boat that someone else wasn't taking the greatest care of, or you might just have some sun damage, or who knows. And so those are kind of your cosmetic damage. And then if you're looking at anything beyond that, you're really kind of starting to call it structural damage. And structural damage is a pretty big spectrum when it comes to fiberglass, because it can be structural damage that is like wear and tear over time, an area on the boat that experiences high load and high force, and it has developed some stress cracks in some corners, or maybe the transom has a cut down transom well, and there's some stress cracks in the corners where the motor bolts up.
Continuous beaching of your boat.
Yeah, continuous beaching can make the bottom soft. You can also notice some stress cracks inside strakes sometimes, and a lot of times those strakes are directly underneath the stringer. Most manufacturers try to run their stringers where at least one side of the stringer lands on a strake, if they can, or over it sometimes. But so because of that, if you look underneath a boat and you're looking, maybe you're going to buy the boat or you're just doing a inspection of it, you want to look in the armpits of those strakes, for lack of a better term. I'm not sure actually what the proper term for that is, but look inside the corner that the strake makes running down the boat. And if you see a crack that runs the entire length of the boat, especially if it's on both sides, that's definitely indicative that you have some structural damage. Backcountry flats boats are famous for this when they have that, and lake and bays too. When they have that stringer failure, you can see it from the outside very clearly, but it's common in a lot of other boats too. You have to be able to identify the difference between a spider crack that might have come from an incident, like on your gunnel, say a midship, right about where there might be a dock piling or something that you pulled up to, or you're pulling up to the boat ramp or a dock. Maybe the wind's blowing or you're coming in a little hot. You bounce off the piling, then you could end up with some damage that basically looks like spider cracks that start in that focused area where you made impact with the piling, and they spread outwards.
Imagine shooting a glass pane with a BB.
Yeah, exactly. And basically what that is showing you is that at some point, the fiberglass flexed beyond the limitations of the gel coat's ability to flex with it. And maybe the fiberglass took damage underneath the gel coat as well, or maybe it didn't. But typically, fiberglass is a lot more flexible than gel coat, which is essentially not flexible at all. So you can have circumstances where the fiberglass flexed beyond the gel coat's range, but the fiberglass didn't fail. Or you could have circumstances where the fiberglass flexed beyond the gel coat's range and the fiberglass failed. And you have to use a little bit of common sense when you're trying to determine the difference between these two things, because when it comes to fiberglass repairs, there's just such a big variation really on how acute the damage could be. And so if you're going to repair the area, no matter what, or no matter how severe, if you're trying to repair some stress cracks, let's say, then you don't have to worry too much, because inevitably, in order to fix those stress cracks, you're going to grind the gel coat back to at least see the raw fiberglass underneath it. And then you'll be able to conduct an assessment at that point to see how much of the laminate needs to be grinded out and replaced.
How would you describe to someone who has just grinded away gel coat for their first time what exactly to look for a delaminated fiberglass throughout the layers?
So when you're grinding, if you were to grind the gel coat off good fiberglass, then what you would see under there is kind of going to look like maple syrup color, and it's going to be a uniform in color, and you're going to be able to see, the fibers within the fiberglass, especially if you pour some acetone over it or even water. When you start seeing white fiberglass, that is, damaged or delaminated fiberglass or crushed fiberglass. I have to try to be careful with the term delaminated because there's a whole nother realm of damage, which includes layers of the laminate schedule peeling off from one another, where there was breaks in the assembly of the hull. So that's something different we're going to talk about. So when I use that term delamination, it's going to be more for the whole bottom and things like that. But if you've got a piece of fiberglass that's damaged and you start grinding away the gel coat, once the gel coat's gone, if you're seeing white fiberglass, then you need to keep grinding until that's gone. And it's one of those things that becomes pretty self-explanatory pretty quickly. Once you get the gel coat out of the way, it's not hard to see really what you're dealing with there. So you basically need to keep grinding until all the bad fiberglass is gone. And if you've done it before, you know exactly what I'm talking about. And if you haven't done it yet, then the first time you do it, it's going to make sense to you.
All right.
Determining the difference between a stress crack that is in a little corner somewhere, or on the edge of a hatch or something like that, that is a stress crack it's what I would call a cosmetic stress crack. That stress crack could be there for another 20 or 30 years. And other than the fact that it's a little bit unsightly, and if the rest of the boat's in really good shape, it's pretty irritating to have those. Some of them, you get a couple of stress cracks here and there, and then they don't get any worse. And they just kind of, I know that's not very scientific, but it's the case.
Live their life. That's it.
They just live their life.
It's just Steve, the spider crack on the floor.
That's it. And, sometimes you can put a little decal over it, or maybe you circle it and you talk to it, or who knows? Maybe you just try to pretend it's not there and drink beer until the boat's pretty. And we've all been there. You have harmless stress cracks. Let's call them harmless stress cracks. And then you have stress cracks that are indicative of structural failure. So a lot of that really comes down to where on the boat the stress crack is located as to how much of a clue it is of a structural failure. If you start talking about stress cracks that are symmetrical on both sides of the boat, that's a clue that you've got something going on that is probably potentially structural. If you've got stress cracks that are anywhere on the hull side versus the top deck, that's something that you're going to have a concern about. Some stress cracks around the transom area are tough. They're kind of on a case-by-case basis. Of course, we'd rather not see any, but it's one of the most common areas to have them. If you're wondering about your transom, we'll probably do a whole episode on transoms, but if you're wondering if your transom's bad, then you need to either do a tap test and you can listen to the different sounds. Hopefully you'll have only one sound throughout the whole transom, and it'll be a nice sharp rap when you tap it with your small metal hammer or screwdriver handle or something like that. If you're hearing different sounds, a tap here and a thud here, and it sounds pretty hollow, really anything other than one consistent sound all the way across usually is indicative that you need a new transom. If it's an outboard boat, you can also trim it up a little bit and climb on the motor, kind of bounce up and down and have your buddy watch the transom, or sometimes you can feel it. But if you put a little force to it, you'll be able to figure out pretty quickly whether or not it's flexing. And if it's flexing, then you're going to need to address it. Other than stress cracks, you have fractures, which usually a fracture is going to be something that stems from a specific event. Stress cracks, structural or non-structural, are things that can kind of progress over time and get worse as you use the boat. But a fracture is going to be something where there was a specific moment where that fracture wasn't there, then something happened. You hit something hit you, you bounced over something, you're going up the river at night and felt a bump, who knows what it might be.
You run up on an oyster bed on a jet ski. You hit something floating in the lake.
I've done quite a few decent size, quite a few, maybe like 3 or 4 significant amounts of damage that were done by channel markers at night.
Yep.
And they
sandbar in the middle of the night.
Yeah, that'll get you for sure. A boat without its nav lights or anchor lights on could be a problem.
Or just irresponsible boaters.
Sure, or a combination of all those. I definitely don't recommend boating at night if you are not familiar with the waters that you're in, especially if you're in a inland or coastal area where you could have rocks or shallow areas. Another type of damage that you might be assessing that would be considered structural would be a core failure in the 90s, early 2000s, even into the mid 2000s, and way before the 90s, starting in the 70s. Many boats were cored with balsa wood. It's very soft, very low density wood that would be attached to a fiberglass scrim board, and it would be scored, and you could form it around radiuses and things, and you bed it down into some wet glass, then glass over the backside of it. And if nothing ever penetrates either of the skins that surround it, and it never has a way for water to be intruded into it, it's a great product. It can last for years and years and years and years. If you screw something down or you make a hole in the deck or something like that, and you don't seal it properly, and over time, water has a chance to seep into those holes, the balsa just absorbs it like a dish sponge. It's not a good situation. And so very, very frequently, I've seen core failures where someone will bring a boat that has a soft spot in the deck or multiple soft spots. And that is often due to wet balsa. And that can happen on the hull too. There's some hulls out there that are cored with balsa. And if you're starting to have some real waviness on the sides of the hull or some strange sounds or characteristics when it's running, it's possible that the balsa core in the hull is wet or delaminated.
And I feel like if it's with balsa, would typically be at the back, like you're running forward, water's coming in and running straight to the back by the motor.
It all localizes around the screw holes. So imagine like you're looking at like a hurricane, and the eye of the storm is the screw hole, and the water just goes through the hole and essentially spreads. So over time, it just gets further and further away from the screw holes. Another core that I've seen failure with quite a few times is Nitacore or honeycomb plastic core. It's got like a felt backing on both sides and plastic honeycombs. It's not a bad material if you use it properly. There's a lot of guys out there aren't big fans of it. I'm in that category. I think that there's a lot better cores out there, but if you don't have other options for whatever reason, you can do a decent job with Nitacore if you have to, but it's not my first choice. But I've seen issues where you walk across a Nitacore deck and it sounds like you're walking on popcorn, and it's just crunchy, and you can hear each individual cell of plastic honeycomb under your feet crunching and cracking. The felt has broken away from the plastic. The resin doesn't really penetrate the core, the honeycombs, because that's the whole point, is that it's hollow in there. It saves you resin, but builds thickness. And so whatever the bond is between the plastic and the felt is, in my opinion, it fails. So I'm not saying anything against that product specifically, but I have other options that I go to first for something like that. The Venesil being one of them. PET board is another good option. Most boats these days are built with composite sandwich construction. So you build the thickness without having the material cost of pure fiberglass or the weight of pure fiberglass. And certain cores have different characteristics to them. And anytime that you have plywood or balsa wood or potentially Nitacore, I haven't seen issues that were really directly related to water intrusion into it, or if they were, I didn't really put it all together. But those are the cores that I typically repaired the most failures on. I don't think I've ever had someone bring me a Venesil hatch and ask me to recore it, but I can't tell you how many balsa ones I've done. Other than soft core, or scratches, dings, gouges, stress cracks, or a puncture or a fracture from hitting something, the only thing we haven't really covered that you might be doing as a repair is if you're filling over a hole that has been cut. For example, a gauge on your console or a speaker hole or something like that. So we're going to talk a little bit now. Now that we've determined what kind of damage we're looking at, we can make our plan to tackle it. And really, it all starts with the grinding. You want to identify the area that you're going to repair, and you want to isolate that area and protect the rest of the boat. So one of the things that I like to do is take some plastic sheeting. The automotive industry uses a lot of plastic sheeting. They'll cover a whole car or a whole boat. You can get it in 16 or 20 feet wide, and it comes on a roll of, 150 feet or something, or 200 feet, I think. And you just pull it over the whole boat, and then you tape it all down around the edges, or, wrap it around the trailer or whatever you want to do. And then you can cut out the area that you're going to repair and tape it all down to the boat, isolating your area. So it kind of looks like you're doing a surgery. Everything else is covered, but the area you're going to work on is exposed. And you want to do a bigger area than you think, because that plastic is not the most durable. So if you were doing like a 1 foot by 1 foot repair, I would give myself a 4 foot by 4 foot area that was cut out of the plastic. And then you can mask inward further from that with paper or something like that. The more you interact with that plastic throughout the job, the more likely you're going to be to tear it up and put holes in it and things like that. So you want to kind of put it out there in the perimeter of your workspace and then try to treat it nicely and kind of set it and forget it. But once you have the rest of the boat protected, so you're not going to fill all your upholstery or your interior with fiberglass dust, you can start doing what I call some exploratory grinding. And for this, I typically just use 4.5 inch grinder, 36 grit wheel. You can use a flat disc if you want. I'm not a huge fan of those things. I think the longevity on them is not as good as a regular good quality fiber disc. And you're going to, of course, wear your PPE, your eye protection, and your respirator at a minimum. A dust suit if you choose to. A little bit of a fan for ventilation is always a good choice. You can do a shop vac. Sometimes I've found that the way that dust is slung off of an electric grinder, shop vac doesn't have a whole lot of a chance of catching it, but it does more than nothing. So if you want to do that, you definitely can. But you basically are going to start in the center of the damage where you know needs repaired, and you'll just remove the gel coat. It's not even, an 1/8 of an inch thick or so in most areas. You're going to remove that gel coat. It's probably quite a bit less than an 1/8 inch thick in most areas. You're going to remove the gel coat until you can see the fiberglass, and then you're going to assess the damage just visually. You can pour some acetone. I've said a few times already. You can pour some water on it because you're going to grind it. It's going to dry, whatever. I mean, use your common sense. Don't get your masking all wet. But you can do something so that you can start to get the dust off the surface of the fiberglass and wet it temporarily so you can look into it instead of just on the surface of it. And you just want to grind until you get rid of anything that's damaged. Sometimes you're going to run into a situation where you get all the way through the thickness of the laminate. Maybe you ran up on a stump and it just punctured through the boat. So there, obviously, you're going to grind through the entire thickness of the boat in certain areas, and you're going to have to bevel out all the way around it. And in a circumstance like that, you're going to figure out to either do a backing patch through the front, which can get a little bit tricky. Ideally, you have access to the damage from the inside. Maybe you can reach down through a hatch lid, or maybe it's a simple kind of boat where it doesn't really have a top deck. Maybe there's a way that you've got to cut out part of a tub that sits down in the deck to get to the backside of it, especially if you're talking about below the water line, or realistically anywhere that you're doing a structural repair from a fracture or a puncture. You want to try to address that repair from both sides. And this goes twofold for stringer damage. If you're seeing the stress cracks inside the strake from stringer damage inside the boat, you could put 3 inches of fiberglass on the outside of that, and it's not going to help you. You've got to get in there and look at the stringer, retab the stringer, figure out what failed, and address that structural issue as well as the failed laminate in the hole. So you're looking at 2 different repairs, kind of, in a situation like that. That's a little more complex than what we're going to get into right now today. So we're just talking about a general repair. So if you're punctured all the way through your laminate, you're going to do everything you can to get to the backside of it. If you can get to the backside of it, and what I suggest is you do your first grinding on the backside, and let's just say, for example, that you have a 6 inch by 6 inch hole that's punched through the side of the boat mostly, and you can get to the backside of it, and you can prep an area that's 24 by 24 inches, or 18 by 18 inches would be good. Or if you have limited access, you do the best you can. It's if you can get to the backside, even if you don't have the greatest bevel ratio, at least you know that you've got something more than nothing in there. But if you have great access, then make yourself a nice big patch, because you're not going to have to body work it anyway. Prep the whole area with your grinder. If you can't get in there with a grinder, use some 36 or 40 grit sandpaper on your hand. Clean it all really well before you start scuffing it. Spray it with acetone. Scuff it all up as much as you can. Spray it with acetone again. Then take yourself some big patches of fiberglass, 1708 or 3610 or whatever you have around, or some thick structural glass, layer a couple of layers together, wet them out, and stick them on the backside of that damage. Let that cure. And now you can address the rest of the whole repair from the front side. You've got some structure on the backside. You know that you can grind bad glass until you get to good glass, and then you can proceed as you were before. So now when you come out to the front side of the glass, for whatever you want to call it, the outside of the hole, and you start grinding, as soon as you get through the damaged fiberglass, which was the entire laminate thickness, you're now going to start grinding into the patch you just applied. And as soon as you see that you're grinding the patch, you stop. And you've removed all the bad fiberglass. You've got through to the new glass. Then you can measure the thickness of how much glass you've grinded out, replace that glass from the front side by applying fiberglass layers. You can either make them get bigger and bigger as they work through your bevel, or sometimes I'll just make them all the same size and stack them up and have to grind a little more on the outside edge. It doesn't really bother me to do that, because once I'm slinging dust, I'm slinging dust. But that's probably the easiest way that you could repair a hole or something like that. Let's say that you had that same repair. Let's say you've got what's going to turn out once you're done grinding it to be a 6-inch diameter hole in the side of a hole. And there's no way to get to the backside, or you're not willing to do the work that it takes, or whatever it may be, but you have to do your best to repair this. 6-inch by 6-inch is a little bit of a big gap to jump by just slapping a patch on the outside while leaving that span open. So there's a bunch of different ways you could go about that. But what we're going to talk about is basically a backing patch that you're going to make, and you're going to fold it up somehow and stick it through that hole, even though it's bigger than the hole. And then you're going to pull on it and keep some tension on it while you put one layer of glass down. So things that you can use for a backing patch would be like
aluminum tape.
Aluminum tape aluminum tape if you could reach through to apply it to the backside. But I'm referring right now to a backing patch that you're going to have to apply from the front side. So I'm thinking something like galvanized flashing or some plastic sheeting. Maybe if it's small, you could cut the side of a plastic bottle off and, cut the flat part off and make that work. Or you can use a piece of cardboard if you have to, or a piece of masonite. Really, it's only limited by your creativity, but it has to be something that you can fold up or roll up a little bit. And let's just keep going with this 6-inch hole example. You're going to make a circle that has an 8-inch diameter. And you're going to put a hole exactly in the center of that circle, and you're going to feed a piece of fishing line or something through that hole and tie a knot in the back. So you can hold it by that fishing line, basically. And then you're going to roll it up, and slide it through that hole. And now you basically have a piece of galvanized sheeting or flashing or something like that hanging inside the hole off of a string. And you can pull on that string slowly and position that backing patch now where it's evenly over the hole, and you would in theory have a 1-inch overlap around the edge on the inside. And you can break out the old glass man's welder, as I like to call it, the hot glue gun, and just put some very minimal dabs of hot glue in an area where you're not going to glass. Try to get it on that 1-inch surface where the backing patch is going to touch over the existing glass from the inside, and put a few dabs of hot glue. And then very gently with that string, you pull it tight. Don't pull it too tight, otherwise you're going to dish the center upwards and make it too thin right there. But you're basically just trying to give yourself a work surface that you can build some glass to. And once you have that in there, if you got a decent job with the hot glue, you can cut that string. Sometimes you can't get it to hold, and you actually have to hold some tension on that string the whole time and just glass one layer over that of 1.5 ounce or 3/4 chop strand mat or something that's going to have just enough strength to it that you can now run your bubble buster and your roller against it once it kicks. So once that cures, cut your string, scuff it all over, and now what you have is the entire bevel thickness ready for you to apply glass to it, but you've got a solid area to build glass over. That makes sense the way I described that?
Yeah, that sounded good. You don't want a Band-Aid. You need something that's going to be on both sides.
Yeah, well, you can't jump the glass. You can't jump a big hole with the glass sometimes. So you need to put something on the inside so that it'll hold the glass while it cures. if you can't reach in from the back.
Yeah.
And if you can reach in from the back, I recommend that you put your patch on the back before you lose the shape by grinding the front. Then you can grind the front back to meet the patch on the back and glass in between from there. So that's a way that you would address a puncture or a fracture or something like that. If you're talking about stress cracks that you want to address, then it's all the repairs start the same way. You have to grind until you get the bad glass out. And then by the time you've removed the bad fiberglass, I mean, you're kind of just rolling with it at that point, but you essentially assess how much glass you've got to apply. There are some rules when it comes to removing glass, or some guidelines that you can go by when you're doing, it's called a bevel. When you're grinding around a fiberglass repair, we call that beveling the fiberglass. And what you're doing when you're doing that is you're exposing new fiberglass to bond to, and you're also, because you're essentially making a sloped edge that leads downwards into the center of the repair, you're expanding the surface area that you have to bond your new fiberglass to. So when you're doing a bevel, you want to use the guideline of a 12-to-1 ratio outwards. So we're talking about how big your repair is going to end up. And a lot of that depends with how thick your fiberglass is. So in this example, we're going to talk about a pure fiberglass laminate that is a 1/4 inch thick. This could be a center console or something like that. If your fiberglass is a 1/4 inch thick and you're going to use a 12-to-1 bevel ratio, that means that you are going to do a 3-inch extended area all the way around the extent of the fiberglass damage. So you're going to go outwards 3 inches from the furthest point where it's damaged into the good glass 3 inches. You're grinding as much fiberglass away as you can while leaving just enough to maintain the shape you need if it's a complex shape. Once you use your 12-to-1 ratio, then you can just measure and mark around it with a wax pen or a Sharpie or a pencil or something like that. And now you know how far you have to go. The depth that you have to grind is dependent on the damage. One of the things that I like to try to remind people about when they're repairing fiberglass is that you can only reapply as much fiberglass as you take away. So imagine that you're talking about a surface that needs to be repaired, and we're going to use a construction term here, and then we're going to mix it in with a boating term. But if a surface on a boat is flat and smooth and level, then we call that fair. It's fair, it's smooth, it's clean. In construction, the term that I'm going to use is the grade. It's basically the intended elevation that the surface should be. So we're going to mix this together a little bit. When the surface is fair on a boat, we're going to call that at grade. That means that the fiberglass shouldn't be any higher than that. It shouldn't be any lower than that. The grade of the glass is the level that it's at when everything is good. So now let's take that piece of glass that's quote unquote fair or at grade, and let's say that it has some damage on it. But the damage is mostly cosmetic or some stress cracks. This doesn't require us to grind all the way through the entire thickness of the laminate and start over on our laminate in that area. This is just going to require us to grind until the damaged fiberglass is gone. And once we get through all the damaged fiberglass, then we're just going to reapply fiberglass to that area and then grind that back and do our body working and our gel coating, etc. So in that circumstance, when you grind your glass out, then you now have a dished out area that is below grade. And so however much material you remove, let's say you grind it out an 1/8 inch of fiberglass to get all of the damaged fiberglass gone. Well, now you know that you need to apply an 1/8 inch of fiberglass to replace it. There's no sense in applying a 1/4 inch of fiberglass over that, because you're going to have to grind an 1/8 inch of it back off, because the end goal for your repair is to be back at the grade that you started at.
Makes sense.
Keeping in mind that you're going to end up back at grade. I mean, you can build some glass up and you can, fair around the edges and kind of shimmy here and there, and you can bring it up past grade and hide a repair in certain areas. But using a hull side, for example, if you were to build your glass up too thick and then just try to make a ramp around it with fairing compound or Bondo and try to kind of smooth it all together, then when you look down the side of that boat, you're going to see a hump in it, right?
And plus gel coat, so you're adding another little bit that's going to actually reflect the light.
Yes, exactly. So it's noticeable. You have to bring it back to that same surface profile that you started with. And so you have to keep in mind when you do that you have to remove enough glass initially to let you put enough new glass to have the strength that you need. So don't be shy when you're grinding. Depending on where it is, if you're just tabbing, then you can grind for adhesion. That's fine. If you're tabbing stringers to a hull or something like that. But if you're doing a repair where you're going to follow it up with a cosmetic repair and you're looking for the best results that you can get, then you need to keep in mind that if you don't grind enough, but you leave too much glass on, a lot of the times one of the mistakes of not grinding enough in the beginning is that you also don't grind enough afterwards. So what happens then is you didn't take enough glass out the first time, then you applied too much glass, and then you grind over that glass to try to smooth it down, and you didn't take enough of that off either. So now you're definitely going to have a hump.
And you just got new glass over still
damaged glass. So one of the things that I like to do, let's just keep going with this 6-inch hole example. Once you have your patch done on that hole, so this is a 6-inch hole, and let's say it's on a 1/4-inch laminate. Let's say it's on the side of a console. So we've got a 6-inch hole that we're going to add 3 inches all the way around. So we're going to add another 6 inches to that. So now we have a 12-inch diameter repair area. So once you have all your grinding done, what you can do, if you haven't maybe ground all the way through the laminate, but you're trying to figure out how much glass you need, you can span a mixing stick or a straight edge if it's flat, or something that has a little backbone, but you can bend it over it and it will maintain the profile. And then you can look underneath that thing, the gap under it over your bevel. If you can measure that with a micrometer, or you can slide something in between it, then you can get yourself a measurement of how much glass you need to add.
Aren't mixing sticks about 1/8 of an inch?
Mixing sticks are about 1/8 of an inch long, 1 inch wide, and 12 inches long. And I use them to measure so many different things. Sometimes it's a straight edge. Sometimes it's a 1-foot-long tape measure. Sometimes it's an 1/8-inch shim. Sometimes it's a hot glued wedge. Sometimes one unlucky mixing stick might be all of those things. I buy them by the big box full, and I use the heck out of them for a lot more than just mixing resin. So that's something to keep in mind. They're very cheap, very handy things to have. And I'm not talking about the little tongue depressor popsicle stick style. I'm talking about like the ones that you
11-inch mixing stick that you get from Lowe's for mixing your paint.
12-inch. But yeah. So now that you've beveled out your repair using the 12-to-1 rule and making sure that you haven't left any bad fiberglass, then you're ready to start to apply your material to it. So it never hurts to give it an acetone spray again and just clean the surface off. But now that you're to that point, we're going to start talking about material selection. What kind of fiberglass are we going to put in this repair? Well, the first thing that you want to try to establish is what kind of fiberglass you just grinded out of it. You can cheat and look from the backside. Then sometimes you can see the surface of whatever the last layer was put down, and it might be obviously 1708 or something like that, but you can't really always go by that. It'd be an unusual circumstance where you could just look and be like, oh, look at that 24-ounce there. What you need to do is think about what the function of that part of the boat is. If you're filling a speaker hole on the side of a center console, then you can just use chop strand mat. You just build chop strand mat until you have the right thickness. Of course, you want to build just a tiny, tiny little bit past grade so you can have enough to grind back and start your gel coat work, but you don't want to put so much extra glass that you make an hour of grinding for yourself that wasn't necessary. So if it's a cosmetic part of the boat, or you're filling a speaker hole or something like that, or you need to use it in an area that is a very intricate shape, maybe it has some compound and convex curves, maybe it has some really tight corners, maybe it's a combination of all of those things, then your best option is going to be to use chop strand mat. Chop strand mat is a bunch of random fibers that are held together by a binder, and that binder breaks down with the styrene that's in the poly or the vinyl ester resin. So essentially, 60 seconds after you wet that chop strand mat out with resin, now this does not count for epoxy. This is only for resin that has styrene in it. The binder that holds all those individual fibers together is going to dissolve, and those fibers are going to become independent from one another. And when you roll over it with a bubble buster, you can really, really get it to go where you want it to go. You can push it around a little bit. You can kind of mix things up. And if you take your time and you're patient, you can basically conform chop strand mat to almost any shape with no air voids behind it. If you have some really, really complex shapes or some very sharp radiuses, then what you're going to want to do is apply a little bit of radius putty into that area first before you start laying your chop strand mat over it. Hopefully that radius putty will occupy any areas that otherwise would be air bubbles. So the advantages of chop strand mat are basically just that. It's the most conformable of the fabrics that you're going to use. And if you build it up thick enough, it does have some pretty significant strength to it. It's really good for bulking and building thickness, but I wouldn't really consider it to be a structural fabric. And that's what we're going to get into next. Your structural fabric is basically what I call structural fabric, at least, is anything that's woven, anything other than random chop strand mat. So that's going to be 1708, which has the 4590 bias to it with the chop strand mat stitched to the back of it, or 3610, 4808, all these different fabrics. Most of them that you're going to buy these days are already going to have some chop strand mat stitched onto them. And the reason for that is just the chop strand mat conforms into shapes better. It gives a better connection surface to whatever you're glassing to. Having that chop strand mat in between the fiberglass that you grinded and the chop strands is going to allow the glass to really bite into that layer a little more. It bridges the gaps and it changes thickness as necessary, and it squeezes into the corners, and it just makes a really nice way to seat your woven fabric onto your laminate. So you're going to want to use woven fabrics when you're doing a structural repair, like a transom, stringers, or if you're replacing a deck, you're really going to want to get at least some 1708 involved. The weakness to these fabrics is that they do not conform as well, especially if you have a compound and a convex curve at the same time. To go around just one kind of radius is fine. One of the weaknesses to woven fabrics is that you cannot wrap it over a shape that curves in two different directions. That you have to form a pleat or cut or dart a relief and fold that fabric in those areas. And so because of that, it's very hard to apply a woven fabric into a complex shape and keep it really nice and clean. But a lot of the times those complex shapes may be in a transom or something like that, where you have to get some of the benefits of the woven fabric. And so in a circumstance like that, what happens is you do your skin coat with mat. Most of the time it's chopped, so chopped strands, and they will put a really heavy chop down onto that area in a production circumstance before they squeeze or lay their woven fabric into it. And that chop behind it just acts as a landing pad for that woven fabric, basically. And anywhere where it might not have made contact before, that chop kind of tries to bridge that gap a little bit. Then you do your darts and your folds. And if you really want to try to clean it up as much as you can apply some chop strand mat over the back of it while it's still wet. And that will kind of push those pleats and folds together. But basically, you can't just take a roll of woven fabric and work it over a complex shape like you can with chop strand mat. But once you get it on there and it cures, it's significantly stronger because it has continuous unbroken fibers. And you can choose the proper fabric for your job and orient those continuous fibers in the direction that the stress will be applied onto that fabric once it's cured. Really, your woven fabrics, you want to get them in there, but if you build some thickness with chop strand first, then it gives you a lot more versatility. And then your woven fabrics, you just kind of do the best you can. And if you do a layup with some woven and it's not pretty in certain transitional areas, then you just grind those areas out and you do another glass, or you touch it up with some chop strand. Or if you had to take a lot of the fabric out of an area where it needed it, then you would do a spot layup and with a nice overlap around the surrounding area, touch up those areas with some woven fabric. As you can tell, most of the time you're going to be using these fabrics in conjunction with one another. And we're going to have a whole episode where we talk simply about material selection for a repair or a build. So we're going to get into detail. When I've said woven fabric so far, it's a very generic term that covers probably 30 or 40 or maybe more different sizes and combinations of fiberglass that you can buy. So we're going to have an episode where we really drill down and get into which fabric is good for what. And those confusing numbers, 1708 and 2410 and all these different things, what do they mean? And can you use those numbers to to figure out what the fiberglass is. And yes, you can. We're going to save that for another day. One of the things that you're going to have to determine when you're doing a repair is your resin selection. What kind of resin are you going to use? That is a highly controversial topic in the social media side of fiberglass for sure. You post a question on one of the groups, you can get a billion different answers. So I'm just going to give my opinion here. The majority of production boats, unless they're semi-custom or high-end boats, are polyester resin. If you're modifying or repairing that boat, you're going to be just fine to use polyester resin. If it's an older boat and you really want to try to get some really good adhesion and you've got a budget to get the best materials, then you can use vinyl ester resin. Vinyl ester is a significantly better resin than polyester. It has more corrosive resistance. It also has less shrinkage, and it's overall just much stronger. If you leave 2 inches of resin in the bottom of a cup and you do one with vinyl and one with poly, and you slam them both on the ground, the vinyl is going to take 5 to 10 tries before we break it, and the poly is shattering on the first try. It's nothing against poly. It just shows you how strong vinyl is. Vinyl ester, and we're going to have a whole episode on the science behind resin, so I'm just lightly brushing on this topic too. But vinyl ester is kind of like a polyester epoxy hybrid. If when in doubt, if you know you're working on a polyester hull, but you still want to be able to use gel coat without worrying about amine blush and things like that with epoxy, and you want to do the best job you can buy vinyl ester resin. For almost anything that you're going to repair on a boat, you're just fine using polyester resin. If you start getting into things that you're not sure what you're working with, or you're not able to identify what resin you have, and maybe it's a jet ski, maybe it's one of those sheet molded composites or something like that, or the nano cell, whatever Yamaha did with their skis a little while ago. When in doubt, you can use epoxy. The rule of thumb when you're using epoxy is that you can stick epoxy to anything, but you can't stick anything to epoxy. Polyester and vinyl ester resin will not bond to epoxy resin. So once you start going down that epoxy road with your resin, then you're kind of committed to that. You can, in theory, gel coat over epoxy, and that's a whole another highly debated topic, which I'm not going to get into right now. But to keep it simple, if you're using gel coat and repairing a boat that's made with poly, use poly or vinyl. If you're using something where you're not sure what it is and you're going to end up painting it or something like that afterwards, and you don't need to use gel coat and you want to use the highest possible quality resin, you can use epoxy. Or maybe you're making something from scratch. Maybe you're cold molding a canoe and wrapping some Vinyl core with surfboard cloth or something like that. If you want to use epoxy for that, that's just fine. It has a lot less fumes, so it's less irritating. If you select the right version of the epoxy, you can get more working time. It's very, very strong. Great corrosion resistance. It's just a little bit more of a finicky resin. And if you use it with chop strand mat, you have a little bit of a harder time because that binder doesn't break down between the fibers and it just doesn't quite lay down like you would be accustomed to it laying down if you were using it with polyester. One of the big differences that you're going to notice between epoxy and the polyester or vinyl ester based resins is that the poly and vinyl kick on a percentage, a 1 to 3% range. Really, vinyl ester, it's recommended that you don't go under 2%. And I don't recommend much going over 2% either. 2% is pretty much the happy spot for vinyl ester. But when you're looking at epoxy resins, they're going to be measured on a ratio. So it's going to be like a 2 to 1, 3 to 1, 4 to 1 kind of thing. 3 to 1 is pretty common. If you use West Systems, they sell them with a ratioed pump kit where you put the little pump on the hardener and the big pump on the resin side. And it's a 1 to 1 ratio on pumps. So that's a pretty nice little option that you have if you're going to do a small or, well, really any epoxy project. The really nice thing about that is it makes it very easy to work in small batches, which is one of my main tips for any laminating, especially if you're not experienced. When you're kicking your resin, you don't need to make a gallon at a time or half a gallon at a time, unless you're about to put a big piece of material out and use a 9-inch roller and you're going to lay most of it out within a few minutes. I recommend working in 1 quart or half gallon batches. You know, a lot of the times, if I'm using a bucket and a roller, I get 2 buckets. I take 1 bucket and I pump resin out of the 55-gallon drum into the bucket. And then I take that bucket and I fill into the other bucket. And you can either measure with a quart cup and then pour it off into your laminating bucket. Or sometimes I like to just make marks on the bucket if it's bigger layups. On a 5-gallon bucket, 2.5 inches is 1 gallon. 1.25 inches is half a gallon. And for quarts, I just use a quart cup and pour it off. But those are nice, easy little cheater measurements. And what I like to do sometimes is draw a Sharpie line on the side of the bucket. And then you can just pour off from one bucket to the other till you hit the line. And then you know whatever amount of catalyst you're using. Let's say you're doing 1%, 40 cc's per gallon. And so it just makes it a lot easier for you, especially if you want to do a big layup with small batches. You can just keep coming over and pecking away at it. And when you do that, it makes it a lot less likely for the resin to go off before you're ready for it to. That is one of the most irritating things that can have happen in the fiberglass world, in my opinion. We've chosen our resin. We've chosen our fabric. We've prepped our area. We've kind of masked our area. So now we're going to tighten up our masking a little bit. What we're going to do is take a piece of paper or something like that and hang it underneath the repair area. So right where the fiberglass grinds into the gel coat along the bottom of the repair, we're just going to take a piece of tape and paper, and at that level, but kind of parallel to the ground, we're just going to tape the paper across. So now as gravity goes, if any resin dribbles downwards below our repair area, it's going to be caught by that piece of paper instead of dribbling down the hole before it lands on our plastic. And you want to do a couple of sheets of paper, so, or pieces of roll-off masking paper to make that transition between paper and plastic so that everything under where you're laminating is going to be protected. What's on the sides of it and above it don't matter as much unless you're just being super sloppy. Gravity's not going to really cause you any problems on the sides or above. So for the sides and above, what I like to do in general is I'll take 2-inch masking tape and mask all the way around my repair area, 2 layers. So I've got 3.5, 4 inches of buffer zone around the perimeter of my repair. And then anywhere underneath the repair is completely covered because gravity will get you every time. Gravity and Murphy are buddies. They always seem to find a way to team up and nail you at the worst possible timing. When it comes to laminating your fiberglass repair, one of the most important pieces of advice that I can give you is just to plan ahead as much as you possibly can. I recommend that you plan ahead by picking and choosing your weather conditions, your timing, having all your materials ready, all your cleaning supplies prepared. All your fiberglass should be cut to the size that you're going to use it if you're able to do that, unless you're using like tearing off little bits of chop strand and filling in areas as you go, which is like a pretty oddly specific, unusual circumstance. For the most part, if you're about to lay something up, you can prep your fabric ahead of time. You can have your couple of resin buckets or just a resin bucket and a cup that you're going to kick into. Have your box of gloves right there close by. Have your acetone sprayer close by. Have a bucket that you're going to clean your tools up in close by. And have anything that you don't want to get resin on that's within a reasonably close area covered or protected. And this is just the kind of common sense stuff that's going to sometimes or oftentimes make the difference between success or not. When you turn around and you are using a roller and a bubble buster and all of a sudden, for some reason, there's a little corner that you can't get into and you need a brush. And instead of saying, oh crap, and having to get up, climb out of the boat, go find a brush, come back, climb back up, try to not knock anything over, get back into position and then use the brush, turn around and reach over and grab that brush that you put there just in case. It makes the world a difference sometimes, especially when you're talking about only having 12 to 20 minutes of working time, depending on your ambient conditions. After you have everything as prepared as you can get it and just basically trying to plan ahead for any unforeseen circumstance, you want to pick the right time to do your layups, if it's a bigger layup. If you're just doing like a fist-sized piece of glass or something that's reasonably small and you plan ahead, you should be able to get that done within the working time of almost anything. But I cut my teeth on fiberglass in Florida, so I'm used to fighting the heat and the humidity. And so basically that's one of the reasons why working in small batches is critical, but you can also do things like work out of the sun. One of the best things you can do is not be in direct sunlight. And of course, if you get the timing right and you're not going to have a lot of dew settling, you can work at night. That's one of my favorite things to do if I don't have a shop. Best option, of course, is to work indoors in a shop, either air conditioned if possible. I've never had that luxury, or sometimes even then strategically you might have to work at night, just so you get those cooler conditions. If it's a big layup.
Sorry, aren't most resins have their timestamp done per like 70 degrees or a specific?
Yeah. So the resin that we use is spec to last 32 minutes at 70 degrees. In the wintertime, they give us the 27-minute resin, and in the summertime, they give us 32-minute resin. And that's just literally the difference between a 2,700 part number or a 3,200 part number. And ideally, that extra 5 minutes sometimes makes a difference when you're talking about the outside conditions being a little warmer. We have everything prepared. We're ready to kick our resin. If it's a poly or a vinyl, we're going to kick it probably at anywhere between 1.25 and 2%. If it's a vinyl, we're definitely kicking it at 2%. If it's a poly, then we're going to be looking around and seeing what the ambient conditions are. And if it's really warm out, then we're going to kick on the low side, maybe even 1%, 40 to 50 cc's per gallon. And if we're going to go 1.25, that's 12.5 cc's per quart. So you can use eyedroppers, or you can use the kind of little cups the kids measure medicine in. Or there are even pipettes you can get that have CC markings on the side, and you can kind of turkey baste their catalyst out of a little cup. Or they also make a catalyst cup that has a measured secondary cup on top, and you squeeze the bottle and it squirts the catalyst into the top, and you can fill it up to 5, 10, 15, 20, or 25 cc's. And those things, for the $8 that you pay for them, they're one of the best investments I think you can make if you're doing a glass project. To have a measuring cup that's built into the catalyst cup is huge. I can't tell you the amount of time it saves to just be able to squeeze and dump, squeeze and dump, squeeze and dump, depending on how much resin you have in the bucket. You just do the math real quick based off 1% being 10 cc's per quart. And it gets pretty quick once you've done it a few times. You now have your resin catalyzed, and you take you're always going to start with chop strand mat, in my opinion. You don't want to go straight to anything woven, even though it has some chop strand on the back of it. If you're just starting your lamination onto a repair, you want to start with at least one layer of 3/4 ounce or 1.5 ounce chop strand mat. Some repairs, you can build the whole thing up with chop strand mat. Sometimes you might put a layer of 1.5 ounce down, and then a few layers of 1708. You get a little structural repair going on. If it's in a gunnel or something like that, maybe you've already had an opportunity to measure how much glass you need to add. So you've got an idea how many layers you want to put in beforehand. One thing that you can do is do a little test laminate of your proposed layup schedule into the repair. And if you lay it up and trim it and then measure it, and it's the same thickness that you get when you span across your bevel area and measure underneath it, then you know that that's the right amount of glass. So little things that you do like that can save you time, and not putting an extra layer of 1708 versus grinding off a whole layer of 1708 it's nice to not have to do that, especially if you can just take a little bit more time and really try to figure out how much glass you actually need. So you've catalyzed your resin, you've started applying your mat, then you've added your 1708. You're going to use a little metal bubble roller, bubble buster, to work out any bubbles as you go. And then once you're approaching the last layer, I like to finish all my repairs with a layer of chop strand mat too, provided I'm pretty close to landing on grade. That is, then I can grind that back a little bit, scuff it back, or maybe in some high spots, grind through it, and then go over that with a layer of fairing. And that lets me start the body working process, where I'm kind of transitioning out of my fiberglass repair and into the realm of cosmetic repair. I'm going to be filling the highs and lows that might be within like a 16th inch of variation after I'm done grinding my glass, or maybe an 1/8 of an inch in some spots. Or if it's, if you're glassing up a deck on a boat or something, you might have a variation up to 1/4 inch or 3/8 of an inch, or it depends how much time you take to really set yourself up ahead of time. But one of the things that I like to do is do my glass work as clean as I can, instead of just kind of like going to battle and slopping it all over the place and putting way too much and having it be all over. And I've got a bunch of cleanup work. I like to think of it a little bit more surgical than that. You put the right amount of glass on, or a little bit extra, so you got something to cut back into. Do it the first time. Don't slop resin all over the place. Don't just be dunking your brush and flipping it everywhere, or dunking your roller and making a huge trail of resin all over the floor. Get your bucket close to what you're working on. shake the extra off a little bit. It only takes an extra second or two. You can also pull some of your extra resin out of the layup once you've put all your glass down. If it's looking kind of sloppy and like there's resin all over the surface, you can squeeze the resin off the roller with your gloved hand, or you can use the crescent shaped part of a 5-in-1 tool, and you scrape that resin off your roller back into the bucket until the roller's dry, and then you can roll back over your repair and soak up some of that unnecessary resin. And that's one way that you can leave yourself a nice, clean, tidy work area before you start grinding, so you don't just have to come into a mess.
So does my boat float now?
Yeah. Let's say that you're fixing a hole in the bottom or something like that. You have completed the structural repair at this point, and now you're going to move on to selecting your filler and selecting your top coat. And those are things that we're going to cover in another episode. But I hope that we've given you a good idea on the basics of what it's going to take to do a fiberglass repair. And I realize, guys, that there's a lot of times where we're talking about these things and we promise not to go into more detail and, we're going to save that for another episode and we're going to save this for another episode. And the truth is, each one of these topics could be discussed for hours and hours and hours on the intricacies of masking techniques and prepping techniques and transitioning between one grit of sandpaper to the other before you apply your gel coat, and all these different little things that make the differences when you do it every day. But we simply can't get into that level of detail on every aspect of it when we're covering such a broad topic as a general fiberglass repair. But I do promise that once we start bringing in some of these other people who are industry specific, we're going to bring in someone who's going to tell us only about mold release. We're going to bring in someone who's going to tell us only about flake repairs. We're going to bring in someone who's going to tell us only about which resin to choose and how it works and why. We're going to bring in someone to tell us only about additives for your gel coat and the circumstances to use them in and the proper primers to use for tooling and plugs. We're going to talk to people who have experience in the racing industry. We're going to talk to people who make this equipment. We're going to talk to some people who build boats all day long, every single day. So these are things that are coming down the pipeline. We've been working pretty hard to just kind of establish a baseline with everybody so far and kind of where we're at and get some of the basic stuff out of the way. And we're going to be digging a little deeper pretty soon here. Hopefully you've listened to a few episodes by now and you're kind of rolling along with us. If this is your first episode, we're really glad to have you and welcome. We do have a Facebook group that you should check out if you're new to this. It's called Fiberglass and Composites Tips and Tricks. Go ahead and join that. Make sure you answer the questions or you will be denied. There's 85,000 plus members in that group. It is a super useful group for any questions that you might have. And we'd be happy to have you over there. So unless you can think of anything that I missed.
No, I think we covered it pretty well.
Well, we're going to do this thing again next week. So hopefully you'll come back and see us then. Until then, it's Boats and Pros out. Bye-bye.